So this video is the addendum to the tutorial for the Blue Open Studio trending feature. And as mentioned in that video, the trend feature in Blue Open Studio is the most complex feature in the software outside of scripting. And there are so many different settings that can be configured for the trend control object and the trend worksheet that we decided to break up the video into a basic configuration to get the trend worksheet and trend control object operating via a normal historical trend graph, and then to do a addendum video that goes through all of the additional settings that are available for the feature. So we will first start in the worksheet, and we did not look at the advanced features. So if we click on advanced to open the trend advanced settings, and the trend advanced settings are used mainly for batch historical information. And what batch historical information is essentially a snapshot of data from the configured tags in the trend worksheet. So instead of it doing over time, it takes a snapshot of that and saves it off as a file, as a batch file. And inside of here, we have several fields that are configured for tags. The start and stop with a tag entered in here. This tag will allow you to stop and start the batch job. When the tag in this field is set to true, meaning non-zero value, Blue Open Studio will either start saving data to your batch file, if you're using the proprietary format, or add a new register to the batch history table in the database. If the tag goes to false, meaning zero, it stops the batch job. And then we have a field for the batch name. And it depends on the format selected for the worksheet. So if it's proprietary format, the name should comply with the path and file name. Where the path is an optional field, if it's not specified, then batch history file will be stored in the root of the application directory, so where the ABP file is stored. If the type is set to database, then the name field will be stored where the batch name field in the table is stored. Then the delete field, when this tag changes its value or toggles, the batch will be deleted based on the value in the name field. And then the existing field is a way to check to see if a batch file already exists. If a batch file with the value that corresponds to the value in the name field exists, this tag inside of existent will get a value of 1. The tag configured here will get the description of the batch file. And this is only available when using the database format. Then down below we have disk space control. This allows you to set a time in days for deleting the batch files or compressing them down to save space. And then an option for what to do when you try to write a batch file and you have tags with a bad quality. You can select what type to use. Min, max, and tag value are pretty self-explanatory, or just a straight value, and that value can be entered in here. NaN essentially means not available. But with min, max, or tag value selected, you have an offset. So what it does is it will take the value and will either add or subtract this offset to the value and then write that in. And then you have a field for disable all data saving via this batch job. So when this tag value is true, you will not be able to save any data via the batch function. So now we'll look at the additional settings for the trend control object. So I'll double click to bring up the object properties. And we already looked at the points dialog, so we'll begin with the axes. And in here, it is broken up into the x-axis and the y-axis. So for the x-axis, we have two options for data type, be it date and time or numeric. Date and time is like a traditional trend graph where it just displays historical data, and numeric turns it into an XY or scatter graph. And for date and time, we have different settings for the period or the type of date and time we want to view. With auto selected, which is the default, the trend control object works two different ways. When the trend control object is paused, it uses start date time type. When it is running or playing, it uses time before now. and we will view both of those additional types as well. So for auto, the duration field is the window of data to view in the graph. So by default, it's set to 1 minute. We could set this to anything we'd like. We could set it to 36 hours. We could set it to 2 seconds, whatever we want. And the time field is used primarily for the other two, the time before now and start date and time options. So for start date time, this works in conjunction with the tag configured in the time field. And what it does, this tag defines the start date and time for the control object, and the duration gives us how much time we want to view. So if I put something in here and say I wanted to look at 12 a.m. this morning, with the duration set to 1 minute, I would see from 12 a.m. to 12:01. With time before now selected, the tag in the time field will tell us how the amount of time before the current date and time to look at. Well, the duration is still the window of the graph. The time tag will give us how much time to actually plot for the control object. And then we have the option for scale format, and this gives us the capability of changing how the time fields down below the graph itself look. We can change the font, we can change the type of font, the size, the style, the color, whatever the case may be. Then we can say, what do we want to view? Do we just want to view the hour, minute, second? Do we want to have the milliseconds? Do we want to have the date, time, and year included as well? And the number of labels, meaning do we want a label on the right and the left, or do we just want one label along with the duration? By default, we just view hour, minute, and second. And then we have options for the grid. And by default, it gives 2 divisions for the grid, meaning it will run 2 lines, so actually give you 3 different sections on the grid. Then we have the option for the time bar and the scroll bar. And then we have a field here for the scroll bar where we can enter in a tag. And this scroll bar and the tag correspond to this bar right here. And with a tag entered in to this field, it will define the period for the scroll bar. This can be set differently than the duration, but if it is left blank, it will default to the same value as the duration field up here. Then we have 2 buttons, one for cursor and one for position. Inside of cursor, we can either enable or disable the cursor for the trend control. And this isn't like how we did it during runtime. This will either allow the cursor to be used or not. So if this is unchecked, the cursor will not be available at runtime at all. And then we can select the color, and we have 2 fields, one for position and one for value output. If we put a tag in for position, it's essentially a percentage of where the cursor lays. 0% is all the way to the left, 100% is all the way to the right. So we can dynamically change the position of the cursor with a tag. And then a value output. What this will allow us to do is it will return the value of the x-axis where the cursor is currently positioned. And then the position, this dictates the behavior of the pens. By default, the placement is at the bottom and direction is left to right. So that means that the pens will start in the bottom corner on the left side and begin to plot heading to the right. As the value increases, the pen begins to draw upwards. We can change this for placement to top, which means it'll start in the top corner, and as the value increases, it'll actually draw downwards. And then we can change the direction. Instead of coming from the left, it comes from the right. And then our orientation. Do we want it to scroll horizontally or do we want it to scroll vertically? And then we can also set our vertical label orientation for how the labels for the x-axis appear. Those are the settings for the date time data type for the x-axis. If we change it to numeric, now the period changed for min and max value, meaning a range that we view. So this changes it to a scatter graph or XY plot. But everything else remains the same. The only thing that is disabled is the time bar. Scale format though, all it does is it gives us what the font is and the number of labels. So it gives us what the min and the max are, and that's it. Everything else remains the same for the x-axis. I will quickly cancel out of this and go back in just to retain the settings that I already had. And then below that is the y-axis. So when we set up the pens or the points, we were able to give it a minimum and maximum value for each point. This y-axis setting is for the entire graph itself. So when you disable multiple sections and you draw them all on the same area, this is where the y-axis values come into play. By default, it gives us 2 divisions or 3 sections. And we can change the color similar to how we could do it up on the x-axis. And then we can give it a scale, a min and max value, and we can now enable or disable the capability of using multiple sections here. And just like with the cursor, if we uncheck this, the multiple sections options will not be available at runtime. Then if we go under format, we can give it a scale, which means the size of the font, the type of the font, the width, how many decimal places, do we want to truncate zeros, and how many labels do we want to view along the y-axis. And that corresponds to these values here. Like most other features, all of these fields can use a tag to dynamically set these at runtime. We will include in this video description a link to a dynamic trend demo that will show you how this can be configured. So now we'll look at data sources. And data sources only apply when our data type inside of the axes is set to numeric for the x-axis. I can still configure them right now, but they will not take effect. So in the data sources dialog, we have several different fields. All of them are disabled until I add a new data source. So I'll click new, and I'll just add a new one. So my data source is test, and now I can select my source type, be it a text file. It doesn't have to be a text file. It could be a CSV file as well, a batch file, or a database connection. And depending on our source type here, this data source setting window will change. For example, I have database selected, so now it comes up with the database configuration dialog, and we'll cover exactly how this is configured in another video. If I select batch, I now have a different data source setting where I just give it a batch name. With text file, I give it a file name and what my possible delimiters are. And we can have one or all of these or multiple selected as our delimiters, whether or not we want this file to be read-only. And yes, this can also have a tag to dynamically set what file we want to display. Or we can just browse and statically select the file we want to use. And then with those selected, depending on your source type as well, this field and these checkboxes will be either enabled or disabled. So if we leave it a text file, then we give it a x-axis field value. This indicates in the data source file or database what column or what field to use as the source for our x-axis. Then below that is our max buffer. And this is the amount of data in bytes that will be held inside of runtime memory. In the load progress field, the tag configured here will receive a real value between 0 and 100 that represents the percentage of the data source load progress. And then the field below that is the annotation source. And the name of the database table that contains text and image annotations to be displayed on the trend control. This is some more advanced settings for configuring images or text that can be plotted or displayed along the trend control object. And then we have the options for sort and keep open. Sort will alphabetically or numerically sort the data before it plots it. The keep open file keeps the data source open as long as the screen containing the trend control object is open. This improves performance during runtime. However, it may lock the file out from access through other features. So if you are, for example, accessing a CSV file through the trend and you are attempting to also write to that through another feature, say a background script, it will lock that CSV file out so you will not be able to write to it. And then we can select multiple data sources and just select them from the drop-down list for what we want to use. And yes, most of these will be able to use tags as well. If you do not get the insert tag, you would just simply have to put the tag name inside of curly brackets in order to use it. I am going to delete the configured data source and back out. And now we'll look at legends. In here, this configures the visible legend options available to us or the available. And we can also enable or disable the legend during runtime, meaning whether this is available at runtime, not whether we can configure it during runtime, because we can do that as well. So similar to our alarm or event control object, we can configure the label and the width and how this specific field is aligned down in the legend right here. So for example, if we don't like average and we want to change that to AVG, we can do that. We can also select whether this one is available at runtime. So we can pick and choose which options we have available to view. Any that are in the visible column will be available at runtime because they're visible, but we can change some of the options anyway. However, some of them have an icon versus a label, and unfortunately that cannot be changed. We can modify the fonts, reset the order, or give the maximum size and the number of items. And the maximum size is the maximum number of rows. So for example, if I made this 4, and so before I do that, let me change average back to average, and I click apply, you now see that I have 4 rows down here instead of 2. And the selected item field, with the tag entered here, it will give us the row number of the selected item in the legend. The number of items is the total number of points that are displayed on the legend. And you can allow a user to add and remove points during runtime regardless of the value in this field. But like everything else, it can use a tag, so you can dynamically set this. The same with the maximum size as well. So now we'll leave that set as it is. And we will look at Toolbar. And Toolbar is at the top here. And we can either show or hide the toolbar in general, or we can pick and choose which of these items we want to show. And it is set up in a data grid view with the command and the option for showing or hiding, and then the column activation tag. And what this does is, with a tag entered in here, when that tag changes value, it will trigger one of these commands. So for example, we put a tag in here for run or stop. Whenever that tag changes value, if the trend control is running, it will stop or pause it. If it's stopped or paused and the tag changes value, it will then revert back to run. Then we have the label for the tooltip, which we can change as well. And in addition, you see that we do not have an option for entering in a tag. And if we were to put a tag inside of curly brackets, we're able to do that. So that was stop. And then last but not least is the advanced dialog. And we already discussed the update trigger and how we can modify that to increase the frequency of drawing on the graph. Below that is the update interval. So the update interval is the counterpart for update trigger when the x-axis type is set to numeric. So the value in this field will be added to the minimum and maximum values of the x-axis when an update trigger is fired. Below that is the load indicator, and the tag configured here will indicate the progress for loading external data. The tag receives a value of 1 when it is loading the data, and it will receive a value of 0 when it has finished loading. And this typically is for either database connectivity or when we load data for a numeric type for XY graph. Then we have two checkboxes, move to current time on run. This checkbox, when enabled, if you pause the trend control object and you go to resume or play, it will jump to the current time. If it's disabled, when you pause, and let's say you pause it for a minute and then you resume, you would have to scroll to the right a full minute in order to get back to the current time. The retrieve bounding samples checkbox, with it checked, what it will do is whenever the values for the pen goes outside of the minimum or maximum range, it will still draw a line up to it and then back down to the next point that's plotted. With it unchecked, this improves performance because it will still plot those data points, but they won't be visible and a line will not be drawn to them. When the value comes back inside of the acceptable or configured range, a line will be drawn from the last value inside of the range to now the current one. And then below that, we have the runtime configuration. And we have options for saving, loading, and a file name. And this corresponds to the layout of the pens, what pens are being viewed, what the zoom is, and things like that. So with tags in here, when we toggle those values for save or load, it will do the corresponding function for the view. And we can give it a file name, or we can browse and select a specific file. So we can either enter a tag in here or give it a static file name to use. And then what it will do is it will save or load that file based on the trigger that is fired. There's also a box for autosave, meaning that with this box checked, whenever the view is changed, it automatically saves it off to a file, which is located in the web folder of the application directory. And then the custom point selection. This interface allows you to create your own custom dialogues to modify or insert pens on the trend control. And it starts with what screen do you want to open or launch when a user triggers this command to modify or insert a new pen. And you have all of your available screens listed in this dropdown. And then you have an option for point number, which indicates the point associated to the pen that will be inserted or modified. Once again, a static value or tag can be entered here. And the add indicator is a flag that indicates that the user triggered an action to insert a new pen, which is a value of 1, or modify a pen, which has already been visualized, which is a value of 0. So this is a way for you to customize or create your own custom interface, similar to how we modify the pens with a pre-canned layout for the trend control object. And then the export to file option. What this does is it allows you to take a snapshot of the trend control graph and save it off as an image. So you have the trigger field. So whenever the value of the tag configured here changes, it triggers an export. Then we have the field for file name, which once again can be a static string or a tag, which can include not only the file name but the path as well. If the path is not included, it saves the image to the web subfolder of the application directory. And the status field, this tag configured in here will receive the return value for the save. Then we have our format, and this dropdown gives us an option for what type of file extension to select. We have several different options. The auto defaults to BMP. Then right below the format is the size for the file to save, or the dimensions. And you can add tags in here to dynamically change what the size is. But by default, the size corresponds to the size of the trend control object that has been drawn on the screen. Below that is decimation. And with this enabled, what it does is it divides the x-axis into a number of intervals, which are determined by the maximum number of points. And all of the data within each interval is averaged together and drawn as a single point. This helps improve performance because there are fewer points to plot. The max points are the total number of points that you want to view on the screen. And this is the number that it takes into account for segmenting out the x-axis into different intervals and averaging everything. And this can be a tag as well, entered in as curly brackets. And then at the very bottom are options, which are similar to other screen objects. We have what virtual keyboard we would like to use. If we want to enable translation or include this in our multi-language feature. The ignore X filter, this is for database connectivity. So with this box checked, the X filter is ignored to avoid adding the where or querying clause to the data source. So if you have issues connecting to a database and it has to do with the querying clause for the data source, you can check this and it should help with connectivity or communication. Then the auto format box, with it checked, the decimal values in the current, cursor, min, max, and scale columns will be formatted according to the virtual table created by a built-in function called set decimal points. That is all of the additional settings for the trend control object. Once again, down in the description is a demo application that is configured to dynamically set your axes, along with another one that will show how to dynamically configure different pens and different points for an X, Y, or scatter plot. I recommend that if you want to know more about how some of these settings are configured, please look at that. In addition, the PC demo application that comes bundled with the software has several different uses for trend graphs, including taking a snapshot of the trend graph and placing it into a report. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact ProFace America Technical Support by phone at 1-800-289-9266, option 2, or by email, support@profaceamerica.com. You can also visit our website, profaceamerica.com, for manuals, drivers, product FAQs, and other product and software information. Thanks again, and have a great day.